Welcome to this video produced by the Global Scholars Network on Identity and Conflict, a partnership between the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University and the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University in Belfast. I'm really delighted that our guest today is Dženana Šabić Hamidović, a behavioral and social change professional based in Sarajevo and someone with really long and valuable expertise of working in the crucial fields of social protection, of inclusion and human rights-based approaches to policy development. Dženana, I'd like to start by asking you a question about your post-conflict work in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In many post-conflict settings, one problem is the lack of a shared narrative, and the lack of a shared narrative creates an enduring difficulty sometimes for peace building, for reconciliation. Could you offer some reflections about that in the Bosnian context, please?
Sure, Richard, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be back on this podcast. When I was thinking about this question, now listening to you, it's for Bosnian context. I think when it comes to the peace building, this is quite easy one, right? It's the shared narrative about the grievings of the past. And that's the most difficult topic when it comes to the peace building and shared narrative, because everything else, when it comes to, how citizens would like to state to function, services to be available to them, in general, quality of life, this is where people they have something in common. But when it comes for, how do we talk about the past and the grievings of the past, this is something that then things get tricky and difficult. And one of the things that maybe if I can offer a bit of hope is also that we see that a lot of people are now talking about sharing a narrative about the geographic space that Bosnia is covering, rather than maybe national identities. And there are very remarkable groups who are fighting to preserve our rivers and our nature, who are saying, no, it doesn't matter on which part of the country we live, we want to protect these. So there is something happening, but the challenge still remains, how do we share the narrative about what happened in our past?
Thank you very much. That's fascinating to hear. And you mentioned geographic space. Sometimes in post-conflict settings, what we're dealing with are multiple conflicts that vary according to geography, to social class, sometimes to other dynamics, sometimes to age in terms of what you've experienced. In the Bosnian case, you mentioned something there which is a message of hope in terms of geographical space. What would be the most pressing fault lines which remain divisive for people in terms of the possible multiple ways in which people look at the legacies of the conflict?
Well, if I can be completely open, that's our constitutional structure, the Dayton Peace Agreement, who served its purpose in stopping the conflict, right? But it actually somehow cemented the structures that reinforce divisions, actually. And so when you talk to the people, what are the possibilities of going beyond the conflict and how do we get together and kind of try to change something? There's administrative barrier, which is not that easy to overcome, which is a peace agreement, which established these structures that actually, even if you want to have political willingness to try to go beyond ethnical quotas and ethnic kind of identities, you can't, because the Dayton Peace Agreement is actually guaranteeing 3 constitutional peoples, and others are just others. So, this is very kind of, it's a challenge. It's a political challenge. It's a political will. But then on the other hand, it would be unfair to only say that that's the only thing. And as I said, there is also educational systems. We have 3 different curriculas, which means 3 different histories and 3 different narratives about not only the past war in 90s, but if you look at the Bosnian conflict, actually Balkans one, we go way back, even to the Turkish Ottoman invasion. That's also 500 years back that we cannot agree what happened. So yeah, also education system is something that keeps dividing us as well. And also one thing that struck me recently when I was facilitating dialogues about how would peace look like, and one of the focus groups said something that really struck me. And they said that, you know, people here don't want the war because they don't, yeah, they don't want, they talk about peace only because they don't want another war. So for us, how does positive peace actually look like is something that we still don't have the clear idea about. We only know that we don't want a conflict. And when we talked about it, you know, what is it preventing us to discuss more openly about how do we want to live, like what does the peace look like for us? One of the participants said, I have a feeling that for some of our generations, especially those maybe older ones who lost so much in the past wars, they are afraid if we move beyond the conflict, that somebody will stole their past, which is so painful, which is so unresolved, that they are sticking to it so hardly because there's a fear of losing it. I mean, we do, I cannot say that that's wrong, because we do have that very weird practice in the Balkans, not talking about our sufferings. That's something that happened after the First World War, then especially Second World War, where some of the people felt that they were not able to talk about their losses. And I'm afraid that that's something that is kicking in now for the past war. I don't know if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
It makes great sense. And also, as you're speaking there, Dženana, there's a lot of resonance with the sorts of things that happen here in Northern Ireland, where I'm speaking from. Long unresolved division, a peace process which ended the war, but which in some ways ossified the divisions from which the war came and made it difficult structurally to move beyond that. And a sense also of an understandable tenacity in holding on to certain pasts, particularly people of a certain generation who might have lost and suffered a lot. But on the other hand, as you suggest, there's more to peace than not being at war, and trying to define that is crucial. That brings me to another thing I wanted to talk about, because in all of these contexts, whether in Bosnia-Herzegovina or in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, the contribution of civil society is obviously crucial, but it's also, in much that you just described, I'm imagining education, curricula and so forth, the role of the state formally is very important. Could you say something about the ways in which, in your context, the dominant reality of state power and structures and so forth has either emancipated possibility or perhaps narrowed it down and got in the way and been an obstacle? Because a lot of the time when peace building is done, there's fantastic work done by civil society actors, but in the end, the state often remains as the dominant force and the structure within which we operate. Now,
I will take a risk with responding to this question. My question is that when I think about that, what you just said, I'm also asking myself, did our state ever had a role in peace building? Because, you know, we have these international mechanisms set up to preserve peace in Bosnia. And in most of them, our government doesn't play any role. We have OHR, also Office of High Representative, who is, like, I hope people do know that. So it's an institution that actually makes sure that the Dayton Peace Agreement is implemented accordingly. And so that mechanism is here, meaning that they can, in any moment, they can decide if any politician should not continue its political role, or they can change laws as well that they see fit, which, you know, in some cases that worked well for us, because that also preserved possibility of maybe a new conflict emerging. But when it comes to the peace building, this is something that gave a carte blanche, if you want, to our politicians and our government that says, okay, that's not our responsibility. There's international community, and there's another body which is called Peace Implementing Council, where also our local government doesn't have any role. So these people come together from now and then, discuss how the peace should look like in the country, and then they give some recommendations. But our government, our politicians, they don't take a role in it. So if you take a look, we don't have a key in a government who is responsible for the processes of transitional justice, for example, aside of Ministry of Justice, who holds jurisdiction of the legal processes. But then we don't have a ministry or any structure in the country that actually is committing to peace. So our civil society was born out of the willingness to preserve the peace, but unfortunately, along the international mechanisms that I just mentioned, and many other, such as UN, EU, and others, were the only local actors actually working on peace building. So our politicians actually never felt pressured, A, to work on peace building, B, they never felt the consequence of not working on peace building. Moreover, they were, in many cases, they were rewarded for their divisive narratives by staying in power, by reinforcing fear and staying in power. So when you ask me this question, I was really kind of thinking, you know, like, what would it take for them to actually get involved? Because thus far, they weren't punished for not being involved. They were awarded for it. I really don't see that they would want to have a bigger role, because why would they? They are not losing anything for not being part, and they are gaining because they are riding on the nationalist narratives. So it's a very weak role, almost non-existent.
Because there aren't rewards for them in getting involved in a benign way. That's a frustration. I can hear that in what you're saying. My final question turns, though, to looking again towards the hope, which runs through much of what you argue. And maybe it relates to your point you just made, Dženana, but if in your own work you could identify one goal in the next phase of what happens in your context, which you'd particularly see as being valuable and crucial within peace building, within reconciliation,
I would again
what might that
go
be?
Shoot for a big. I would say a countrywide structured dialogues between the civil society and the government and the political leaders on what do we actually want for this country and how do we want peace to look like. Because when I answered the previous questions that they are not involved, that doesn't mean that there are no politicians or government officials who want to do something about it. So my hope would be that, because now, in order to join the EU, we have these 14 priorities that European Commission has set forward for the country to fill on our road for getting into European Union. And one of these priorities is the key priority 5, which says that the country needs to kind of establish the environment conducive for peace building and look for solutions how to overcome the past. So that's our opportunity to actually say, okay, so we have to do this, right? So this is not anymore, if we want to go in our path of European Union, there is this key priority that is there. So that's opportunity. And I think that international organizations who are very much involved and willing to support the country on this path can be the one to create opportunities, but not the one to lead the process. So that needs to shift. We need to seize this opportunity and have that conversation between the civil society who tirelessly for 30 years worked on peace building, together with those people from the government levels. How do we move forward on building peace or sustaining what we have in this country? And I maybe I'm dreaming, but if I say, okay, that's something that there is this key P5, I'm kind of remaining hope that we can really use that and to have that conversation right now.
Dženana, whenever I hear you speak, I learn so much, and you're honest about the challenges that there are, but you always have a sense both of hope about what can be achieved and also a practical sense of how to get tactically towards those strategic goals. And what you've said today very powerful in terms of your own context and setting, but I've been hearing resonances, as I said, in relation to Northern Ireland. And as you're speaking there, I think of other settings where there's so much that we can learn from your expertise and your insights and your wisdom. And that's really what we're always looking for with these GSNIC conversations. So thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you so much,
Dženana
Richard.
Šabić
This was a
Hamidović.
really
It's been great
short
talking
and
to you. Thank you.
very inspiring conversation as always.